Hello, welcome to New York State PowHer, Women's Equality Wednesday's Google Hangout. I hope everyone is having a great time already because it's just going to intensify. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm Monifa Bandele of Moms Rising, and I will be moderating this public conversation on healthy lives, the economic impact of being a woman. Today's format is meant to invite questions and comments from you. So please tweet your questions using the hashtag PowHerList, and that's PowHerList. After the event, the Google Hangout will be available on powerlist.org. So make sure you check it out and share it with your friends. The New York State PowHer Network is an exclusive statewide group committed to securing economic equality for all New York women. I'm really proud to represent it today. Each Wednesday through the election, we're holding a conversation on key issues which affect women's economic equality. This week, we're going to use our time to talk about healthy lives, securing economic equality by ensuring reproductive options, ending domestic violence, and providing childcare, something that I'm sure many people out there have something to talk about and to add to the conversation. Please note that New York State PowHer is strictly nonpartisan, and the comments of our guests are not necessarily representative of those of our organization. Our Google Hangout guests today are Tracy Brooks. She's the CEO of Family Planning Advocates, which is committed to securing reproductive justice. We have Lorian Castell, Director of Technical Assistance and Member Services for the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And last but not least, we do have a man. We have Gregory Brender, and he's the Deputy Director for Policy and Advocacy for United Neighborhood Houses and a representative of the New York State Winning Beginnings Coalition on Childcare. Thank you all for being here. How's everyone?
Wonderful. Thank you for having us.
Great. Wonderful. Tracy, we're going to start with you. We're going to step back from the current debate focused on choice and reproductive health laws and explore the impact of women's economic equality and security. Family Planning Advocates works to secure reproductive justice. So in that context, what is reproductive justice, and how does the economic well-being of women and families play into those options?
Certainly. So thank you so much for having us. Family Planning Advocates is thrilled to be part of this conversation, as are the family planning providers across the state of New York. So first off, to talk about reproductive justice, it's really the concept of linking reproductive rights with social justice. And so in 2005, a more comprehensive definition, I'm going to read it for you, is really looking at the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, economic, and social well-being of women and girls. And knowing that that will be achieved when women and girls have economic, social, and political power and resources to make the healthy decisions about their bodies, their sexuality, their reproduction for ourselves, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives. So really looking at how the two come together and play side by side. So when you ask the question about reproductive technologies and options, sitting here in 2014, a lot has changed. It's been since 1965 that women who are not married have been able to access contraceptive methods. And we look at the fact that contraceptive methods have really increased from being a daily, whether we look at the birth control pill, which is a daily method, or we look at long-acting reversible contraceptive methods that could last up to 10 years and various methods in between. Women have so many more options that they can make to fit into their own lives based on what their needs are at any given point in their life. So for some women, they may have finished having their families, and they know a reproductive option would be that they may be interested in might be a long-acting reversible contraceptive method that could last for 10 years that she would never have to think about because she's not looking to be pregnant again in her lifetime. Or you might look at a younger woman who knows for sure in the next 3 years she doesn't want to be pregnant. And we can look at contraceptive methods that are long-acting as well and make those decisions. And certainly we have the patch, which is a monthly contraceptive method, the pill, which is a daily contraceptive method. One of the pieces that we know is women are more successful with contraceptive method of choice rather than of their choice rather than of what they can access economically. So being able to make decisions about education, about careers, about jobs, by being able to space our pregnancies and control our pregnancies, the Affordable Care Act has really leveled the playing field for many, not all women yet, but for many women, to be able to access a method of choice without significant economic burden. And then certainly also seeing that access to abortion services and comprehensive reproductive health care for the last 40 years since Roe versus Wade has made a difference in where women are in our society, in our economy, and in our communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And it makes me think so much about how having access to paid leave and other things that you would need if you decided to have a family can really, help you be open to the choices you want to make. If all the laws kind of line up properly, then you can do what you'd like to do, and live out your vision. So that was really great. Thank you.
Women want to make the choices for their family that best suits their family and themselves. I agree.
Absolutely. Okay, next we're going to talk with, we have a question for Lorian Castell. Thank you for being here. Tracy just shared a vision of women pursuing their lives by having and taking control of their reproductive lives. Your work on domestic violence also focuses on control. As well, women in abusive relationships gaining control of their lives is major in their economic security. Can you please talk about that? What is the economic impact of domestic violence on women, and how do you see that play out in your work?
Well, thank you for the question. It actually plays out in a variety of ways. And first, let me just thank you for having the State Coalition as part of this conversation. It's my first hangout and hopefully not my last. This is a fun way to have a conversation. It's important to know that we define domestic violence as a pattern of coercive behaviors and tactics used by one person against their intimate partner to establish and maintain power and control. And economic abuse is just one tactic that we see playing out for people who are victimized. And like reproductive and sexual coercion, which Tracy just spoke to so eloquently, it's often hard for people to see economic abuse. One of the things that happens in our communities and in our helping professions, and even with those who are victimized themselves, is that they don't, if it's not physical abuse, they don't think of it as abuse. If they have not been physically hurt, or if the threat of physical violence is not there, we share a common mythology and perception about domestic violence that it can only be physical abuse to be taken seriously. So physical violence is sometimes present, but not always. And the consequences of domestic violence on the economic stability and financial viability of people who are victimized, particularly women, is far-reaching and serious. But first of all, I would say that experiencing victimization was recently tied to food and housing insecurity.
Yeah.
And this is through the National Intimate Sexual Violence Victimization Survey conducted by the Center for Disease Control, which is sort of the gold standard of domestic violence research these days. I think more analysis needs to be conducted to unpack the connections between victimization and food and housing insecurity, but certainly we know from people who have told us that they've tried to leave that a financial and employment security is the main reason that they don't leave or that they go back to their abusers.
Mm-hmm.
So victims face wage discrimination, pay inequality, again, particularly victims who are female. They're often isolated by their abusers and kept from the educational opportunities that would create the job skills that would help them get to that economic security. Isolation is a very frequently experienced tactic by people who are victimized. And when children are present, it's even harder to leave and to stay gone, right? I would ask you to consider that abusers are very savvy at keeping their former partners in court, particularly with custody and visitation and support hearings. So not only is that an opportunity to further abuse, it's also a way to deplete the resources that the victim may have. So leaving does not always equal safety, and leaving also has a tremendous detrimental effect on a victim's quality of life. Add to that the need to take time off from work, to go to court, and we've created economic instability for that person. That's why my organization supports legislation that would enhance provisions that require employers to make reasonable accommodations to people who've been victimized so that they can access the help that they need. And certainly we don't want for victims to have to choose between keeping their job and getting the legal or the medical remedies that they need for themselves or for their children.
Thank you, thank you. That was so informative, and there's some questions I want to come back to you with, because that was really, you touched on a lot of things there. But I want to bring Gregory into the conversation because so many of Moms Rising members have stories about childcare challenges. I want to share a story of one of our members, Sarah. She said this: "For the first 9 months of my son's life, I was lucky to have my mother watch him. When my mother needed to go back to school, I had to find daycare. My husband and I are both employed full-time, but we can barely afford childcare, and we do not qualify for any assistance." This is one of our New York stories, and we find that, you know, especially with certain wages, it's really difficult, even with both people working, to afford childcare. So my question to you, Gregory, is, this is just one story, but how large is this problem in New York? And what's happening in New York State and in New York City to address the child care crisis?
We have a lot happening, but New York State and New York City still have child care crises. We still have a lot to do, and I want to thank you for including us and for having child care be part of this discussion. The early childhood movement here in New York State, but nationwide, really recognizes that this is both an education movement, but it's also a movement of empowering working families, strengthening women's role. We understand that child care policy and early education policy works best when it meets the real needs of working families. Right now, we have in New York State that you are eligible for child care in most counties when your income is below 200% of poverty. That's a pretty low standard, but still, even with that standard, only 22% of families are being served. We have more than 130,000 children being served, but many more who are not being served, and families are desperately looking for quality care and something that provides both nurturing support and education during the day, so that they know their children are safe, that they can go to work. We also have a child care workforce that's mostly women. We need to ensure that this is a fairly compensated workforce. Child care professionals are among the lowest paid professionals anywhere, both here in New York and nationally. In many cases, they meet the same requirement that teachers in public schools meet, are certified, have training and experience, but have wages that put them barely above poverty. In fact, in many of the programs that members of United Neighbor Houses operate, their children themselves, the teachers, the staff members, the cooks, janitors, other folks who are working in child care programs, their children are actually eligible for child care, you know, in some cases in the programs. So we need to ensure that we have funds to support thousands of children who are not receiving services all throughout New York State, and to support the staff so that they are fairly compensated, so that this workforce, who is doing the incredible work of educating and caring for our youngest children, receives a living wage, fair wage, something that reflects what they are contributing.
That's great. I mean, it seems like it's such a cycle. The child care workers need living wages, and the people who need child care also need living wages in order to afford the child care that's out there. So it's really big.
You know, it's been really exciting in that we've seen throughout New York State, and particularly here in New York City, tremendous leadership to support advances in early childhood education. Obviously, the most attention has come to the expansion of pre-kindergarten.
Yes.
It's a first victory, particularly for New York City, where we're moving to in the next 2 years ensuring that a pre-kindergarten class is available for every 4-year-old in the city. That this is now a right. This is something that one just assumes. We're not basing it on your income or a parent's having a job. This is something, if you're a 4-year-old in New York City, you will have pre-K in the next year. We need to implement that statewide. But we also need to ensure that we don't see pre-K as the end and be-all. Pre-K is 6 hours and 20 minutes based on the school day.
Mm-hmm.
Most parents who are working parents are working longer hours.
8, 9 hours, yeah.
9 hours, and they have to get to work. Not everyone works right at home. Particularly, folks who are, we're here in New York City, but throughout the state you see it, folks who are working in Manhattan are living sometimes in Rockaway Beach. And they have a big commute. We need to ensure that there's options for them that are safe and high quality. We do that throughout the state.
Yeah. I'm glad you touched on the policy work and the fact that we need to go beyond universal pre-K, because I think that a lot of the stories that we're hearing are, of course, of people with kids even younger than that. And so while we're on the topic of policy, because I want to come back around and kind of tie all of this together, I wanted to go back to Tracy, because inevitably our members and everyone watching wants to know, what can they do? What can we do to push this forward? What can we do next? We know about the Women's Equality Act, also known as WEA. What are some other laws what's essential to protecting women's economic well-being? And what would you tell people they can do as connected to reproductive justice and women's equality? What's happening?
Sure. There are a number of bills that have been introduced, and one of them you pointed out right after, or as a follow-up when we were first speaking, and that's paid family leave. I mean, that's the second step for women being able to time when and whether they have pregnancies, is the ability to then say, and I have the ability to have a maternity leave, take care of my child if my child gets sick. Following on the coattails of paid family leave is certainly affordable child care. I can afford to have my child taken care of in a safe place with educational opportunities while if I choose to continue to be a working mom. Those issues certainly impact economic justice for women around our reproductive choices. But even beyond that, we can take a look at, there is a bill that we introduced this year around the Boss Bill, that really mirrors the next step beyond what that Hobby Lobby Supreme Court case that allows companies to determine whether or not the women working for their company have the right to access contraceptive methods through their health insurance that is provided by their employer or that they can purchase on their own. It's rather devastating that it was ruled that the employer can make that determination. Here in New York State, we want to ensure that that people, men or women, are not persecuted against accessing comprehensive reproductive health care, including contraception, abortion services, infertility services, because it's something that their boss or the owner of their company may not agree with. So the Boss Bill is a very important piece of legislation. And certainly the more comprehensive Reproductive Health Act that really looks at modernizing New York State's reproductive health laws, updating based on Supreme Court cases that have been determined, federal policies that may usurp or override what current state laws are, to really update. The most important piece, and I think really the Women's Equality Act is the very first step, is that New York State's women have been and are so strong. We have made such great strides in our communities, in the workplace. Women-owned businesses have really pulled this country out of the recession. We've seen women-owned businesses at a larger rate than non-women-owned businesses growing and creating jobs across the country. We really need to make sure that the laws are as strong and keeping pace with women and families here in the state of New York. So what I would say is speak to your legislators. Yeah. Ask them questions. Be sure that they know that you care about these issues, because the people who disagree with the fact that women should have laws as strong as them are speaking loudly. And those of us who agree that this should be a no-brainer can't sit back on our heels. We need to be emailing our legislators as well.
Absolutely. I can't underscore that enough. And also run for office. We need more women in the legislature for sure. Yes.
It's exciting, so women should really think about it. If we're not at the table, our interests aren't being discussed. There's no reason the Women's Equality Act didn't pass. We are 10 million of the 19 million people who live in this state. We vote at a higher rate, women do, and we are more than half of the workforce in this state. So our issues should not be political. There shouldn't be compromises around what women want, because we're not a special interest. So it's time for us to make sure that that voice is heard.
Absolutely, rah-rah. And we also have a common theme, I think, between what you were saying and Lorianne was talking about, which is this healthcare piece. I mean, my blood boils every time I think about that Hobby Lobby, people who are not healthcare professionals controlling the healthcare of women and their families. And Lorianne, you talked about how in domestic violence situations, access to health insurance is a key factor. Access to housing is a key factor in whether or not people can leave a situation or a relationship or take time off from work in order to get the services they need. But something you said really had me thinking, wow, I want to hear more about that, which is you said that women who are victims of domestic violence also face wage discrimination. And so I want to know if you can touch on a little bit shortly on what that is, because I know our listeners would be interested in finding out how that's happening and also what we can do about that piece.
Well, it's not just victims of domestic violence who are discriminated against in terms of, equal pay. Wage discrimination is, all over the country, which is federal legislation to address that. And here in New York, one of the things that we're trying to address is we've worked very closely with our allies in the legislature in 2009 to amend and expand the human rights law so that victims of domestic violence become a protected class and are able to take that time off so that they can access the remedies that I talked about before. But when we think about the pay inequity, here in 2014, would you believe that women as a group still make less than men as a group? It's shocking, right? And so some of the issues that we're talking about today, in a civilized society, you can't even believe that we're talking about access to reproductive health and talking about reproductive rights, a woman's ability to choose whether or not she'll have children and when, whether or not somebody can go to work because they can afford childcare. Whether or not somebody can access safe and affordable, stable housing when we tell victims that they need to leave, but then we don't make it easy for them to leave. And in fact, studies have shown, I'm actually going off the question that you asked, but studies have shown that when landlords find out that somebody, a potential tenant, is a victim of domestic violence, that they've refused them available housing. And this, again, we live in such a victim-blaming society. We find a way to blame the victim for something that an abuser chooses to do to them. So my point would be that do not make it easy to leave. That the perception that leaving equals safety is something we absolutely need to change. That sometimes people are, making very difficult choices and staying in relationships that it seems inexplicable, but food is on the table, health insurance is there, access to childcare is there, and a roof is over their head. And who's to say whether or not that's not the better choice?
Yeah. It's really powerful. I also want people to check out yesterday, Rock United, the Restaurant Opportunity Center. They just released a report called The Glass Floor. And so not only are women facing abuse and harassment at home, a huge number of mostly women who work as tipped workers and low-wage workers also face abuse and harassment in the workplace. And that's a really great report that just came out yesterday. And everything you talked about made me think about these connections and how, especially those things together, can really impact the economic stability of women and their families. I want to go back to Gregory before we finish up, because one of our members just tweeted that in her state, childcare costs more than college. That's really shocking. That you can go to their state college for a less amount of money than the average child care costs. And universal pre-K was a huge victory. What's next for New York? What do we have to do to push this on down for the 3-year-olds and the 2-year-olds and younger than that?
I think it's really important for parent voices to be a role here for parents who are in child care, and even more importantly for parents who are looking for child care, to make this clear that this is something that they need. There actually was, in 1971, both houses of the United States Congress passed legislation for universal child care, for a system that would come to that way. And in President Nixon's veto message, which was written by Pat Buchanan,
Wow.
warned that universal child care would be a threat to traditional families, that it would
That's a head desk moment.
workforce. And we have had subsequent policy for decades saying public assistance won't be available unless you're in workforce or workfare program. We've had subsequent, more and more families, they need to be dual income. We have more and more single mother families and single father families. The need for child care as a clear economic necessity has been so apparent to families. We need to make it that apparent to members of the legislature and to the governor.
Yes.
We need to ensure that policymakers understand the bind that families are in. And the other thing that I feel families can help with is making employers get involved. This supports making New York State a quality place to work, making New York State a place that will attract talent, that will attract quality workers who stay at their jobs, who get better at their jobs. We need to ensure we have child care in order to keep New York as a strong economic engine throughout the state.
Yes, yes, thank you. I mean, I think that it's just amazing how these three issues kind of work together and they intersect, and that, you know, as women, moms, and families, it can seem really overwhelming. Like, you know, how am I going to fight for reproductive justice, fight against, you know, domestic violence, fight to have more access to affordable child care? And I say to everyone out there, we can do it. We can do it. You know, one resource is this. Yeah. And so, you know, this is the New York State PowHer Network. You can access all of these great experts that we've had here today. You can look them up on the hashtag. You can look at for NYS PowHer list hashtag, and you can also go to the website where we're sharing lots of resources right now as to how you can get involved in the various campaigns that they're running. We want to thank all the panelists for coming and participating in this Google Hangout, and this will be posted right after we're done on NYS PowHer, that's POWHER.org, and we want you to check it out and give us some comments there and let us know what you're doing. Now it's our turn to take action. I mean, it's been said already. Register to vote before the end of this week. Okay, so this is the deadline. You have to register before the end of this week and then vote on November 4th. Very, very key to register and follow up with that vote. I'm going to throw in also think about running for office in the future, even though that's not on this, this list right here, because we need moms as governors for sure, based on what we've just heard. And now's the time to ask your candidate how he or she will tackle your priority issue. Tracy really hammered that home. And, you know, the voting, but then the accountability part is really important as a follow-up. And stay connected with us by signing up for future PowHer activities. I want everyone to please tune in next week for our Women's Equality Wednesdays Hangout. On the 17th, we'll be talking about equal pay, which we've talked about today, because equal pay is also a big part of this mix of things that we need to fight. And our guests will be A Better Balance, National Women's Law Center, and the Equal Pay Coalition New York. Thank you so much, Tracy, Lorian, Gregory. Please come back and hang out with us again.
Thank you.
My pleasure. We'll come back and talk about workplace discrimination.
Yes, yes. Let's do it again. We're gonna have all of you back. Well, I hope I can come back. I'm a guest too, guest moderator. But I'm already inviting you all back. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.